into the Don Juans of Gnosticism at Aeon Arcanum, proudly seducing young Orthodox virgins one at a time, broadcasting live from the hot pleroma of love. This is the St. Valentine's Day edition of Februarius the 15th in the year of our demiurge 2013. Aeon Arcanum is not endorsed or funded by Archontic entities, nor do we accept sacrifices. We're here to slap the highlight Kool-Aid taste out of your mouth. Stay tuned or remain in your ignorance. We don't despise the demiurge because he's small, but because he's petty. Welcome to the shipwreck that is called Aeon Arcanum.
Bravo. Pretty good, James. Bravo. Love the intro.
Hey, I fixed it. I made it even better.
Yeah, last time, I mean, it was kind of... Yeah, we've been having a lot of technical difficulties these past few hours, but finally, please, God, make it work, please. Yeah, maybe the Archons don't like what we're going to talk about tonight.
Yeah, apparently they don't, because Docetism seems to be one of the most misunderstood, probably most heavily debated subjects, and it seems to be, for the most part, the number one reason people will not accept Gnosticism.
Yeah, big time, yeah. Because, well, one, the big things that a lot of people reject Gnostic belief is because of Docetism, because it claims that, well, people claim that it denies the resurrection, the incarnation, the resurrection, the virgin birth, all that kind of stuff, and the Orthodox kind of, you know, are vehemently opposed to anything that kind of denies the whole Orthodox narrative.
So why don't you give us a little rundown of maybe how Docetism evolved, what it is, at least what the common perception of Docetism is. What's the common perception, and you know, who's a good scholar on Docetism?
One really good scholar we've been discussing, James and I, is Simone Petrament. She wrote a book called A Separate God. If you guys can see that. The Origins and Teachings of Gnosticism. She's a French scholar. She basically traces the Gnostic, so-called Gnostic heresy, actually to the New Testament, specifically with Paul, and I think we kind of went into that the first episode, but not that deeply. For example, we see this idea of a docetic Christ, meaning that, well, first of all, just kind of let's define what Docetism is. Like the Docet, like Docete, is, well, it's a Greek term for appearance or seemingly appear.
To seem.
To seem. It's like kind of like a.
But the most popular
illusory.
Definition is definitely to seem or illusionist or something.
Some kind
like
of a trick. It's like it's really a trick. It's kind of like a magician kind of. Yeah, it's kind of strange, but it does make sense in context to what Paul is preaching.
Right.
But kind of before we go into the Docetism, I think I mean I still I don't know if you want to do this. I was kind of like, maybe we could just kind of go over the Archons a little bit and kind of discuss how and what they are and what they are not. Like, because I think we last episode we were talking about how they are what they are, but I think maybe we should discuss what they are not, because I keep seeing the same constant theme of like what
John Lash and David Icke type stuff.
Yeah, and I also kind of feel like we should also go into the Jungian kind of stuff. Like, I see that a lot, especially on Facebook. A lot of different groups are like really into Jungian approach, which
what does Jung see the Archons as? I think he just sees them as mental disorders or something, doesn't he?
Yeah, some kind of like mental projections.
Mental
he
problems.
sees, yeah, like like the demiurge, just kind of like the ego.
Right. Okay, so you're getting in the idea of dickheads versus Jungians.
Yeah.
Basically. I guess we're technically dickheads then, because I don't believe in the Jungian view. Yeah, they're. I don't see how they come to the idea that aliens are archons and stuff and all this stuff. I mean, that's kind of the view you see in like Prometheus
Right.
or Halo, even the Forerunner in Halo. They're kind of the archons that made man, and they kind of are like Aristotle's demiurge. They kind of left. They're like a bad father, like a
Mhm.
deadbeat dad, basically. Like they, you know, dropped their sperm on an egg and were like, "Fuck it, later. I'm not paying child support." And I think that's kind of the Jungian idea, or not the Jungian idea, but the overly
Overtly.
dickheadized version.
Right.
That's the beyond far beyond dickhead version, right? And then you got the kind of dickhead version where it's like we're like, okay, well, we take it literal. We understand that they're literal entities, but we also understand that they're literally demons that possess rulers and stuff, and they reincarnate and all this stuff, right?
Mhm.
And then with the Jung type believers and stuff, they seem to think they're just kind of like mental problems, kind of like what the Shepherd of Hermas pushes in a way, like one is temptation or something, you know, and that's kind of really kind of how the Catholics see it in a way too with Satan and stuff. He's really and demons. They're really just like kind of these mental things, you know.
Yeah. 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 They just kind of like bad thoughts or some kind of
Right,
just like my head is screwing with me. That must be it's my own archons and my inner demiurge
right,
is coming
right. For
out.
me,
Yeah.
that's not what they are. Like for me, they're real. You know, I'm like Plato. Whether they're in your mind or not, they're real. Floating around out there, you know, they're spirits. You can't perceive them with the five senses, you know. It takes a sixth sense to perceive them. So I'm more on the kind of sixth sense wavelength with that because I do believe there's a spirit versus matter dichotomy. And I kind of think once you don't believe there's a spirit matter dichotomy, you're not really a Gnostic anymore. So I don't
You
see how they could
become
just be in your head, but they still call themselves Gnostic and they believe it.
basically like almost an atheist in a way because you kind of deny
Right.
this dichotomy, almost like an Epicurean. Kind of the same people that Paul was
Right.
kind of preaching against.
Right,
Um,
and they're in the church too. I mean, they're all over. The Eastern Orthodox Church is full of Epicureans. They that don't believe that the um, soul or spirit are different or have anything different from each other. You know,
yeah, like the
which is
spirit.
funny because in their creed they have substance. They talk about substance. What the
Hmm.
hell is a substance if there's no different substances? You know.
Right.
So it seems to me there has to be different substances.
Yeah, I mean, well then, as we talked about in the other video, there's the three natures that, all the different premier Gnostics kind of discuss. All the sexy Gnostics that are too sexy for the Orthodox Church,
Yeah,
as we discussed earlier.
too sexy for the church. Some shit. Yeah, that's what it
um,
seems like.
yeah, uh, but yeah, I mean, there is definitely this cognitive dissonance, especially especially in the kind of the Orthodox uh, churches, to say that they pretty much have this view that spirit and matter are basically kind of one and the same.
And they do. They kind of think it's one and the same, and there's not really. I mean, when you're drinking the Heilig Kool-Aid, you see, for a Heilig, they think there's only a Heilig is an Epicurean, like we were saying before. It's a materialist. They think there's only one reality, and everything's kind of tied into that. Spirit and soul are just different words to describe the same thing,
Hmm.
essentially. You know, it's really the way they seem to look at it. But from the Gnostic worldview, I mean, we don't really see it that way. And so it's kind of weird that there's kind of like people that hide out in the Eastern Orthodox, the Catholic, and the Gnostic groups that are Epicurean, which makes no sense. And God, I'm having a terrible hair day here.
um, I mean, when you look at like texts like the Gospel of Truth, I mean, like the author of that is basically saying that matter, when compared to spirit, is basically an illusion.
Right.
Just as Plato would say that matter is like shadows in the cave of the wall. or the wall of a cave, I should say.
The demiurge just called and said, "I have a flock of angels haircut today." I'm putting my hat back on. I look terrible. Wonderful.
There you
All
go.
right.
Looking pimpin'.
Yeah, so looking pimpin'. Valentine's Day.
Valentine's Day. Yeah. I mean,
Like day late.
Day late. But
This is really what it would be if we were following the old calendar. So today's technically really Valentine's Day in reality.
yeah, in another maybe alternate universe, maybe.
Right.
But,
On an alternative calendar in an alternate universe.
But like, what do you think is there a specific connection between Valentine's Day and Valentinus? Would you say, James?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, on Miguel Connor's Facebook, you probably saw it on his for his AM Byte show. He was talking about that, kind of like a blog post type thing. And yeah, I've always believed that ever since I got into Valentinian Gnosticism. I mean, I subscribe primarily with the Valentinian brand. That's not that I don't have sympathy for the other ones too, but yeah, I think through the way he stresses love and the mystical union of the church and God and Christ, I think Valentine's Day very much is a holiday founded and named after him, you know? So.
Yeah, I mean,
the hot pleroma of love sounds like a Valentine's Day thing to me.
Yeah, absolutely. The Gospel of Truth is very, very, almost like kind of like a Valentine's Day card for the poor lost psychics.
Yeah.
As Marcus the Magician would say, there's a hot pleroma of love happening over here, ladies. Come this way.
Pretty much. That's a good one. And now you got your mic, so we can hear you better.
Yeah, I'm excited because before I was all muffled, but now
it was very muffled.
Yeah, maybe hopefully I will sound a lot louder than before.
Yeah, you definitely already, I can tell you do. And well, okay, so let's get into this Docetism thing. Docete or Dakeo. Dakeo is a very interesting word in Greek, and most of the scholars like Bart Ehrman and all these guys, they'll say, "Oh, well, it means to seem or to appear," right? It's doing that thing again in my earphones, so bear with me. If I stop, it's because it's going. Psh. It's the Archons.
Yeah.
So Dakeo is an opinion, a belief, a conceit, a fancy, or a suspicion, or a superstition in a way. And so, really, when they're calling them docetic, it's not necessarily that they're saying they're illusionists.
Mm-hmm.
It's that they're saying that they had this belief that Jesus, some of them had different beliefs. Like some had beliefs that, well, it didn't really happen, it was an illusion. Like you see in the enigmatic library, right?
Right.
And what was it? I think it was the treatise on the resurrection, right?
Yeah, it says the world is an illusion, but the resurrection is actually... It wasn't an illusion, it actually happened in reality.
And Julius Cassianus is said to be the founder of Docetism. He's actually the ex-Archon, the founder of Docetism. And so there you see that word Archon used for a founder, ex-Archon, founder.
Right.
So essentially the Orthodox are saying, like, look, these are their views are silly, and they come out of their own head.
Right.
So Dakeo is a way of saying, oh, you're conceited. You actually believe this even though it's not true.
Mm-hmm.
And the word is used in the New Testament as well. It's used in a passage in Matthew. It's in Matthew 3, verse 9. It's still doing the ear thing, so when I stop, it's because of that. It says, and do not think you can say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. I tell you that out of these stones God can raise up children for Abraham. Well, it says, and do not think. That's Dakeo. Do not, Dakeo, you can say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. I tell you that out of these stones, God can raise up children for Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
So when it's saying that, it's saying Jesus is saying don't think. In other words, they had thought, because they were wise in their own conceits, as Paul says, that because they thought Abraham was their father, that it was true.
Mhm.
And he's also saying, don't think that you can say because Abraham's our father, we're right, or God's our father. So he's alluding to John 8:33 to 58, where he tells them that their father's the devil.
Right. Like I think there's the Johanna Jesus basically says that the Archon has been cast out. It's kind of like the same.
And the stones are the Gentiles in some ways, because he's basically, Gentiles worship idols, and they have, a stone is like a hard-hearted person and things like that, someone that refuses to believe in God. So he's saying that, don't tell yourself Abraham's our father, and that means we have God as our father too, because God can raise up children for Abraham even from the Gentiles.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of there's more meanings to the passage than that, but that's one that occurs to me right now. And surprisingly, in the gospel it's thought to be the most ascetic, which is Mark. The name Abraham only pops up in it once, and here you have a sentence talking about dokeo.
Yeah, I mean that concept of dokeo. I mean that of Jesus being like kind of more like a spiritual being, clothing himself in kind of this weird mishmash of psychic and hylic material,
right?
To kind of deceive the powers and principalities to achieve his mission. I mean, you see that, of course, you see that first with Paul, then it goes with Marcion and Valentinus, so on and so forth.
Pretty much all the Gnostics seem to have followed him on that. The Nahashians, the Valentinians, the Marcionites, the Manichaeans. That's pretty much, as far as I can tell, a very universal belief among the Gnostics.
Yeah, I mean, Paul basically, of course, as we discussed earlier, preached like a Docetic Jesus who never specifically came to Earth, but like in the Jewish apostles and the false apostles preached the human Jesus, who was a different Jesus.
Right.
But I think Paul's Jesus, when you compare it to the Jesus of the Gospels, it's kind of like apples and oranges.
Right. Well, what's funny is Paul's Jesus, actually, his death is entering matter.
Right.
His death was where he actually entered matter. It wasn't dying on the cross and things like that, even though he does speak of one that dies on a cross. But it seems specifically what Docetism is what you're saying is the earliest belief is that he wasn't visible to the powers or the authorities of the Archons as he was descending into matter.
Yeah, he actually, the teaching is he took on the forms of the angels, because the angels to Paul were obstacles to the Christ's mission.
Exactly.
I mean,
and that seems to be very well embedded in his teachings.
Yeah, he basically says, I forgot which text it is, but I kind of remember the gist of it. So something like, "For if he that cometh preacheth another Jesus, whom
Galatians, I
we
think.
have, it's Galatians, whom we have not preached, if ye receive another
let
spirit,
him be anathema.
Anathema,
yeah, let him be anathematized."
So he's kind of pretty much alluding to the fact that there are other Jesuses around. It's not just one Jesus.
There's other Jesus stories.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and Matthew's Jesus is that Jesus. It's very much opposed to the Johannine Jesus, which is more like Paul's Jesus.
Yeah, I think this book.
He's someone that couldn't be trapped in matter.
Yeah, she's basically the author of this book. She basically says that it's possible that the Gospel of John was actually written by Apollos, which was an opponent of Paul, but I mean, I still have to kind of dovetail into that before I make up my mind.
It could have been finalized by him. They went to, because it depends. It's hard because when people say Gospel of John or Gospel of Luke, we don't know how many stages of editing the Gospel of John went through.
Mm-hmm.
But we know there's definitely the unorthodox Gospel of John, then there's the Orthodox Gospel of John. If at least there's two of them, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And the unorthodox version of John is actually where we get the idea that Jesus didn't eat, because in John 4, I think it's 4:27, Jesus was asked if he was gonna eat, and he said that I have food that you don't know anything about. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and so he was saying that he lived off of the will of his Father and the Word of God and all this other stuff. And that's the manna. It's like this secret nutrient, you know?
Right.
And they're thinking, wow, like, what do you mean you're not going to eat? There's like other times when he says things they think he's going to commit suicide.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never really kind of thought about that.
Yeah, so that's why, you know, and you got to keep in mind the Gospel of John is the Valentinian Gospel. The Gospel of Truth is not the Gospel that they use. The Gospel of Truth is just an homily
Right.
about Paul's letters in the Gospel of John.
Mm-hmm.
So the Gospel of John is really the Valentinian Gospel par excellence, you know. And Thomas they definitely would have used Thomas, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, even Thomas is weird though, because Thomas was even, if you look at Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, where they found the Gospel of Mary and Peter, they were being used there alongside the Shepherd of Hermas, Irenaeus. The earliest copies of Irenaeus we have are from there. They're very small fragments. And the rest of it's canonical texts and Orthodox texts. And so the Orthodox were using those. And they think they came from the Pachomian monastery, more likely than the Nag Hammadi library stuff did. So it seems this is original Orthodoxy.
Yeah, you were discussing how Hermas is actually the real Jesus of the Catholic Church. I mean,
Right.
that's kind of an interesting idea. I mean, would you kind of expand on that a little bit more? I mean, that kind of, I was like, huh, I never really thought about that.
Yeah, because in the Apocalypse of Peter, the Coptic one, the Gnostic one,
Okay.
that's where we went over that last time. They have the Hermas, the firstborn of unrighteousness, or whatever, and between the second trees of the Great Seth, Apocalypse of Peter, and Gospel of Judas, and things like that, they seem to be coming from the same mindset. And Paul seems to be agreeing with them, and they seem to be agreeing with Paul. It seems that this Hermas is his teachings. They pretend like Jesus taught the things that he taught. And they worship Jesus' flesh, and that's why they eat his flesh and drink his blood in a literal sense.
You're right.
So they seem to be the people that actually were that Jesus considered apostates in John 6. The people that were walking away from him and thinking, oh, literally you want us to do that? And then they probably came back to it later. But they're people that are very much descended from the Sadducees and the Pharisees, but very much more the Sadducees. But my keeps doing that thing still. It's so annoying.
Oh gosh. Hopefully they'll. Does it keep going like in and out basically?
Yeah, it's giving me a headache.
Oh man, sorry.
It's only when I talk.
That's weird. Wow, wow, the Archons really don't like what we're discussing today.
Yeah. They especially don't like me. They're like, wow, and he's dressed nice. Well, he does it too, bastard.
Yeah, he's too pimping tonight. No. Well, there's one specific quote I wanted to kind of discuss in the second treatise of Seth, or the Great Seth. Can you hear me, James?
Yeah.
Okay. He basically says, in the text, Jesus says, "For my death, which they think happened to them in their error and blindness, since they nailed their man unto their death. But in doing these things they condemned themselves. And I subjected all their powers. They nailed him to the tree. They fixed him with 4 nails of brass.
Right.
The veil of his temple he tore with his hands, for the souls which were in the sleep below were released."
Right. That's interesting, and actually, I wanted to talk to you about that. I'm glad you brought that up because I was
Hmm.
actually just reading that yesterday and thinking about bringing it up. That right there is very, very revealing. It's very revealing that the Gospel of Matthew is taking stuff from the Gospel of Matthew takes stuff from John more than any other gospel.
Hmm.
So he's going in there, he's taking stuff from John, and he's taking stuff from that writing right there. That writing
Hmm.
and other writings that are Pauline like that. That writing's very Paul influenced. And the thing that he takes from is the idea of people getting up out of the ground. Well, right there, notice it says souls rose up out of the ground or out of
Hmm.
death. So in other words, they were trapped in matter and they rose out
Right.
of it like Jesus did. Well, they didn't get up. Their bodies, their flesh and bone bodies, didn't get up and walk around.
Hmm.
And so that's why you don't have a report from any historians of that time talking about that, because it was an event that was spiritual, an event that only people saw with spiritual eyes.
Well, it's interesting. It also says they went about boldly, so not bodily,
Boldly, yeah.
having shed zealous service of ignorance and unlearnedness beside the dead tombs, having put on the new man. So,
Right.
what is the new man in Pauline theology?
It's a spiritual body,
Yeah,
spiritual
it's a
flesh.
spiritual body. Yeah, spiritual flesh.
Right.
It's I mean, it's the new man, meaning that the
Like
old
a
man is
body
basically
made of
died.
light. Yeah.
Yeah, the old man basically dies and he's crucified,
Right.
and the new man is entered into kind of takes out the stone of the heart of stone and replace it with a heart of
Right.
flesh, spiritual flesh.
Right. It's like it goes right into what Jesus is saying in Matthew, though. What this quote originally comes from the Gospel of the Lord. It doesn't come from
Hmm.
Matthew. Matthew took it from him, and actually, it comes from. It probably even more so originates in Luke, and then it's in John later, and John elaborates on what he's talking about. And so he's saying, "I tell you that out of these stones, God can raise up children for Abraham." It ties in directly what he's saying right there.
Hmm.
So that's another thing that's crazy. And then, like I was saying with the Gospel of Matthew, inverts things from the Acts of Pilate, where, or yeah, it was from the Acts of Pilate, or Gospel of Nicodemus, the second part of the Gospel of Nicodemus,
Hmm.
where they have the prophecy from Isaiah about Zebulun and Naphtali. Originally, Hades is actually the material creation. It's the earth.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of like
You find that
confirmed
in
when you
those
look at
writings, those
yeah,
Gnostic, the second treatise of the Great Seth. I think it's in there too.
and you even look at the Ophite diagrams. Well, there's no real actual illustrations of it, but the just descriptions of the Ophite
Yeah, through
diagrams by
Origin.
Origin. Yeah, I mean they kind of discuss the Hades kind of being this
Right.
innermost
That's
or
in against Celsus.
yeah, and like there's also Tartaros, but
Right. Tartaros is something you see in the Acts of Thomas and
mhm.
Second Peter, mostly third century writings.
Yeah, I mean I think those ideas are kind of added into
Yeah.
it. They got a lot of that from the Greeks because
Yeah.
the Ophites are kind of like these paganized Jews.
Right.
Um,
Right. The Ophites are definitely not really Christians, and they're not really even. They're just kind of influenced by Gnosticism and paganism. They're like pagans that like Gnostic ideas and Jewish ideas. They're really weird.
yeah, and I mean, and it kind of explains a lot of the animal-headed bestial forms that we see in the Archons. I mean, especially
Yeah.
when it comes to Egyptian mythology, you have Horus and Set and Anubis and all these different
Right, and they
gods of
represent the
Egypt.
Hylic nature too. The
Hmm.
Hylic nature because it's they're not literally animal headed. It's that they're like
The representations, basically,
right. It's
of
a way of saying this is what they really are deep down inside. They're really just animal men.
I
They
mean,
love matter.
all of these stories. I mean,
They're ayahuasca
they're
trips.
yeah, yeah, for real. See animal-headed gods running around,
Right.
oppressing you.
Right, and I think it was in France in cave paintings. People used to draw back in like 10,000 BC. They were drawing people with goat heads and shit like that, and people with deer heads, and I guess that's where Jägermeister came from. I don't know.
Yeah, I always thought that the Baphomet figure is kind of like an Archon, because
the Baphomet figure is actually very, very old.
the
name's not though.
Yeah, Eliphas Levi popular, makes it very popular in his writings, but
what is it? Eliphas Levi.
Eliphas Levi. Yeah, I'm pronouncing it wrong, but he don't do that. But yeah, so you basically have Baphomet, doing this posture, kind of like, as above, so below, and all that kind of stuff. And
well, Baphomet makes for a great Megadeth song, I'll tell you that.
Yeah. Well, Baphomet, I think it's from what what I've kind of researched has come from Mahomet, which is kind of like a French weird, like garbled word of Muhammad. Yeah, basically. So it's like he's kind of, so they basically use an occult symbol.
They demonized the early church. They were the first people to write about Muhammad, actually, before his own people even really were talking about him in writing. And early Eastern Orthodox or Catholic fathers wrote about him, and they saw him as Satan. Directly, pretty much saw him as Satan.
Muhammad?
Oh yeah. Muhammad was seen as Satan by the early church.
Yeah, I didn't really know. I haven't really read much about Muhammad in the early church. What writings?
Well, 6th century, not really.
Oh, 6th century. Oh, yeah. Or like.
They write about him. I don't remember what writing it is, but I'm sure you can find it on Wikipedia or something. But
okay.
There's a couple of church fathers that write about Muhammad, and they're the earliest known sources on him.
Well, going back to Docetism, I pulled up a quote from Irenaeus where he discusses Simon Magus. He basically says, for since the angels ruled the world because each one of them coveted the principal power for himself, he had come to amend matters, and had descended, transfigured, and assimilated to powers and principalities and angels, so that he might appear among men to be a man, while yet he was not a man, and that thus he was thought to have suffered in Judea when he had not suffered.
Right. The way it works is that originally, at least according to Irenaeus, there's this Simon Magus myth. Simon Magus, he went around saying that he was crucified in place of Jesus, and that he appeared basically as the Son in Judea, he appeared as the Holy Spirit in Samaria or something, and then he appeared as the Father in Rome. And that Helen was Sophia, and Sophia went around as a prostitute, like Aeon, on the exegesis of the soul. She was prostituted and raped and all this other stuff, and went from body to body reincarnating, and she was Helen of Troy, and then she was this and that, and she was a prostitute, which is obviously Mary Magdalene. And so Helen basically is like their way of saying, oh look, Mary Magdalene is this, and Simon Magus is Paul, and this and that. I mean, who knows? They're trying to make it into some crazy story. And like you have the Great Declaration by Simon Magus and other things where, in a sense, it's like they externalized this myth.
Now, do you think Simon Magus has a historical connection? I mean, do you think he's just a myth, or is there an actual historical persona attached to this figure called Simon the Magician?
Well, Simon Magus is a made-up character. He is as much of an illusion as Jesus is to a Docetist. By that I mean that Simon Magus, under the name Simon Magus, who taught these things and said this stuff, never existed. He's somebody that's made up by reading. They took documents from Saturninus or early Gnostics and they read it and they said, oh, yeah, there's this idea about Simon the Cyrene here. That's Simon Magus.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, he teaches this thing by Paul. He says it's okay to eat food sacrificed to idols as long as you don't raise questions of conscience. Oh, yeah, that's him. And he doesn't have a problem with you not getting married and procreating. Oh, okay, yeah. And so they take those ideas from Paul and they spin them into these other things, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Any idea that you can find in a Pauline letter, you'll find in the Clementine homilies twisted into this other thing. And you'll find it in Irenaeus, and you'll find it in Tertullian, and applied to Simon Magus. What's interesting is in Clement of Alexandria, I think it's the Stromata, you'll find Simon Magus is Peter.
Right.
And then you'll find that Menander is Glaucius. And Basilides is the student of Glaucius. He was a student of Peter.
Yeah.
And one more thing. And not only that, but when you look up the letter of First Peter, you're going to find an opinion on marriage that seems to be kind of debating with Paul's opinion on marriage.
Yeah, that makes sense. That would make sense.
So, you know, this guy Simon Magus they made up, he's the split. He's a split personality person that has the spirit of Peter and Paul dwelling in him. And anything that they don't like that Peter and Paul said, they shifted and they put it on Simon Magus. He's a scapegoat for all the beliefs that they don't want to keep. All the traditions that they don't want to keep, he's the scapegoat for those. They rub them off on him, and they send him out into the wilderness, and they say, get out of here, Azazel. You know?
Right.
It's basically what they're doing.
Yeah, you know, Petrament's basic thesis in the Separate God is that, yeah, Simon Magus and Paul were actually the same person. And then, you know, quite literally, he was, as the Church Fathers claim, was the father of the Gnostic religion. Right.
Eisenman thinks he was Simon the sorcerer that's in Josephus.
Yeah,
who was actually a Jew and not a Samaritan.
Yeah, no,
I don't think so.
I don't think that's accurate at all.
Yeah, but that's his thing.
Yeah, I don't think he's on the money at all. But I mean, but Simone Petrament, I think she's a little hesitant to kind of come right and declare that Paul is a Gnostic, but I think that's because, you know, of her need to be taken seriously.
That's because they want to think that Gnosticism is something that started in the time of Jesus and evolved, or started in the time of Paul and evolved. But in reality, it's something in the time of Jesus that already existed. It's not that it was a pagan thing or it was a Platonized thing or any of this stuff. It's just a belief that had always been around.
Right.
It's a set of beliefs that have been around for 10,000 or more years. It's that ancient. You know, it's just a different naming system. Really, to say that it started with Jesus would be inaccurate, but to say that the idea that this redeeming figure had come starts with Jesus or Paul. It does. Before that, they had thought there was a redeeming figure that existed, but he just had not come. This is the realized eschatology of the Gnostics, if you will, the Gnostics who were around before Jesus. He's their realized eschatological figure, you know?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are kind of hesitant to say this. I mean, there's other scholars who are kind of like, yeah, you know, screw it. Yeah, Paul is Simon Magus. But I think before everyone's kind of like, you know, if you kind of go too far for the majority view of scholars and the academic community is like very quick to assume that you're kind of a quack. So I think people like Simon
without even examining their evidence,
yeah, like I mean, like if someone would say, yeah, if someone had actually have real evidence that Marcion, you know, version of Luke or Paul's letters are actually the originals, then it'll probably pretty much overturn a lot of biblical scholars' careers, because they all assume that everything.
The truth is out there.
Yeah, the Orthodox.
Mulder and Scully told me. But yeah, it would turn heads in the academic community big time. But I'd really like to read Petromin's book. I haven't got to read that yet,
Yeah,
but I'd have to go buy it. How much was that book?
yeah, I got that on Amazon for like $6.
All right,
I
yeah,
mean, yeah, it was. Yeah, it's easy. It's cheap as hell. Um, but I think that, the basic message of the so-called Docetists is that the crucifixion wasn't the death of Christ, but was really the powers.
right.
That it was actually a victory rather than a defeat. The Catholics, they basically have read this Christ consenting to defeat, so he would serve as a human sacrifice for the atonement of sins.
Right.
Which is exactly what the authors, like texts like the Second Treatise of Seth, the Gospel of Judas, the Apocalypse of Peter. I mean, they're all criticizing this Catholic idea.
Right, because originally it's more like Anselm's view. Actually, it's like kind of like the Christus Victor view, with things like that. Like Christ defeated the evil powers and he tricked them, and he gave mankind the gnosis so they could be redeemed.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically the original view on redemption. That's the redemption view of the early church, far before anyone like Plotinus or anyone is talking about redemption, which was an idea that he stole from the Gnostics. Plato didn't have any ideas on redemption or any of that stuff.
Yeah, he just kind of talked about how you have to, your soul has to be kind of you're supposed to remember,
right? Some ushy gushy,
some kind of
nonsense.
Thing. Yeah,
Protestant nonsense.
Yeah. Oh, maybe.
That's
but
what it seems like to me, man.
Yeah, well, it's like, Irenaeus basically says in Judas, says that Judas by.
Well, he winds up a little girl, yeah. So I'm going to call him Irene.
Let's just call Judas Irene. Basically, by accomplishing the betrayal, right. He destroyed the principalities and powers, meaning that the author wasn't really rejecting the crucifixion, but basically kind of reinterpreting it.
Right. The idea is that he's tricking the powers, and so
yeah,
he's a trickster. That's what they didn't like about him. That's why they would look at things like the infancy gospel of Thomas, and they'd say, "Oh, Jesus is a trickster, even from when he was a kid." That's because he was a trickster before he even entered the earth and stuff. So they think, oh, that's why they believe all this. But I think they hid very true, very important things in repulsive documents on purpose, so no one would want to figure them out.
Right.
And the things that are literal and are not true, I think in some documents, not one single thing in it is literally true.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a few documents like that, like the infancy gospel of Thomas. I don't think any of it there is something that the person that wrote it believed was literally true.
Right.
And we know that Marcus was using that, so.
Well, I mean, as far as what's literally true, I mean, when it comes to like people like Paul, I think, there is evidence that Paul existed. I mean, like, right. And he actually received these kind of spiritual revelations from a spiritual right. entity that he called Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. But I mean that this whole idea of the principalities and the archons being crucified. I mean, you see that all throughout the Nag-Hammadi. I mean, you see it through like the gospel of the great invisible spirit. Mm-hmm. What's another one? The trimorphic protonoia. Even though these are considered Sethian texts, I mean they're still pretty much into Paul.
Yeah, because some of the texts are the texts that are like Sethian texts, like that are grouped into the Sethian texts that don't have anything Pauline in it. I would say are not Sethian. Some of them, but,
right.
Rather than getting into that, I mean that's a whole other debate in
itself.
When it comes to this whole Docetism belief, there was a lot of church fathers who opposed it. You had Tertullian who opposed it around 198 to 220 AD. He was opposing it. Hippolytus, about the same time period, and a little later than Tertullian. Irenaeus being one of the earliest writers to oppose it, who writes a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And you also have Ignatius and Polycarp and Justin Martyr. And so these are the big guys that are opposing it, whereas Clement of Alexandria is pretty much a Docetist in his own right.
Well, I mean, like, as far as like Sethianism go, I mean, I don't mean to kind of go back there, but I just kind of bring it up. Like when you look at the Gospel of Judas, I think it's basically saying that Paul is probably the only true apostle, and
Right.
and like in the hypostasis of the archons, I mean, which is another Sethian text. I mean, it quotes Paul in the introduction, so I think
Right, and the Gospel of Judas has Paul's thing in
Paul's
it.
ideas, yeah.
Right.
And of course, it quotes Ephesians. And of course, in the hypostasis of the archons, it calls Paul the great apostle.
Right.
So I mean, it kind of goes on and on and on, but
often John is called the apostle as well.
Mm-hmm.
John and Paul seem to be, and then you have a pope called John Paul. So the question is, are John and Paul two different people?
Yeah.
Sometimes I don't think they are, but sometimes I do. It's hard to tell, but it's possible they're the same person. The Gospel of John is loaded with Pauline ideas, loaded, especially with stuff from Colossians. But yeah, it's hard to not see Paul and John. But Eusebius, you had Eusebius and Clement of Alexandria basically saying stuff about Docetism. Julius Cassianus, who was a former Valentinian, was thought to be the founder of Docetism, the group that called themselves Docete.
Mm-hmm.
Serapion of Antioch, somewhere around 180, he, as Bart Ehrman will point this out, he came to the island of Cyprus and he found a group using the Gospel of Peter. And he decided that because the Gospel was prone to heretical misconstrual, that they needed to get rid of it. Now, it was a gospel that was written in Peter's name. It claimed to be by Peter. What necessarily is docetic about it is not entirely clear from the fragments we have, but there's different ideas on what was docetic. This might be the gospel where Christ leaves Jesus to die on the cross. Hippolytus talks about this group in Book 5 of the Philosophumena. Basically, the idea is that one idea about Docetism that these guys have, they're under the impression that Jesus possessed a illusionary, phantasmal body. That's one thing, or maybe that he didn't suffer, or that Jesus and Christ are two different beings, or there's a spiritual Jesus and a physical Jesus, etc., etc. Mm-hmm. And so you'll see things where they say, well, he remained impassible, meaning beyond suffering. Or they'll say things like Christ did not suffer, or Jesus did not suffer. Depending on what they say, it's hard to tell. The church fathers, they slip up a lot. They can't decide whether it's Jesus or Christ, and so, it's hard to tell. And then you have Irenaeus accusing Cerinthus of believing in a human Jesus and a divine Christ. Things like that.
Yeah, well, kind of getting into that, I think we also should talk about how there's different types of Docetism. And I think we were discussing this earlier. I mean, I'll just kind of... And also this idea that all the Gnostics believe the same idea of Docetism, which is not true.
Not true at all. And like we said, the earliest one is the idea that he's trying to go past the powers and the authorities. He comes into matter and takes on a physical body. Whether he does that at birth like a normal person or whether he does it as a full-grown man, we don't know. It depends on the system. And then the man dies and he goes to heaven. And in some systems like Cerinthus, the man is resurrected.
Yeah, and I think the only Gnostic text that actually kind of condemn this idea of Docetism is maybe Melchizedek. That's the only one I can think of. I think she talks about the Pistis Sophia condemning this belief as well, but I don't know where that is.
Yeah. I hardly ever deal with the Pistis Sophia, though, because of how late it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely kind of it kind of reminds me of the um, tripartite tractate because it's kind of this. I mean, it's sort of like a pseudo kind of Gnostic writing, but it has this very strong Orthodox um, flavor to it,
Right.
basically, in essence.
Now, when it comes to things that are perceived as anti-Docetic, a lot of scholars will see stuff in the New Testament and they say, "Oh, this is anti-Docetic."
Mm-hmm.
Like in First John, that's a popular one, where it talks about the incarnation. The problem is that the earliest Docetists don't deny the incarnation. Valentinus doesn't deny the incarnation. Um, Marcion, we can't even go into Marcion because no one denies it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's the most slandered out of all of the Gnostics. So it's really hard to tell. I really don't think Marcion believed in a phantasmal Jesus. I think he believed in a Jesus who sweat blood and suffered, and later that gets taken away by the Orthodox. And I think the manuscript traditions pretty much support that theory. But
Mm.
First John is seen as supporting this idea. Like if you deny the incarnation, then that's what a Docetist is. And you see that first in Polycarp in his cover letter to the Ignatian epistles. He's talking about incarnation.
Well, what's interesting is that I think Marcion's version of Luke says it has like Jesus demonstrating his material existence to his disciples, where he says like, touch me and see that I am flesh and bone. But when you look at Marcion's version, it kind of lacks Jesus' request to be felt.
Right,
And
because
that
he didn't
is,
have to. He didn't have to prove
yeah,
it because he
that I
actually
am
did. He was seen bleeding. Now, you could argue, well, he was seen bleeding. It was merely an appearance. Well, that's it. Everything's merely an appearance to a Gnostic, though. The whole cosmos is merely an appearance
right.
to us. If you read, treatises on
It's
the resurrection,
it's basically the cosmos or the material world.
saying it's an
It's
appearance isn't to
it's
say that it didn't
Docetism,
really happen.
right?
Right, but that's how the Orthodox take it. They think we're saying it didn't happen when in fact we're saying
It did happen,
no, it did happen, but all this is fake. We're
right?
in the Matrix. It's all horseshit.
Right, right. Yeah, it's like it's saying the world, like the treatise of the resurrection, the world is an illusion. The resurrection is, the true reality. The
Right,
resurrection is a pleroma.
right.
Um, Now, do you think Mani believed in Docetism? I mean, kind of think
After the
he may
time of
or may have.
Valentinus is where you see the people that misunderstand Docetism popping up.
Hmm.
And that's who the Orthodox are writing about. They're writing about a group of people who created a belief system based on a misunderstanding of the worldview of Gnostics that the world's an illusion.
Right.
This is Julius Cassianus and everyone that comes after him. So Manny and people like that likely really probably did believe in that. But I'd have to finish reading what Faustus says against Augustine.
Yeah, that's pretty long. It's kind of a long, kind of
He's the
drawn out.
best. Faustus is probably the best source we have for what Manichaeans actually believed.
Hmm.
And you don't find very much of this stuff in Faustus. What Faustus is saying is essentially they use the Catholic versions of the Gospels, but they don't believe in things in them for certain reasons. He argued things like, we don't believe that the genealogy is gospel. In other words, we don't teach it as it's the gospel. We don't have to believe it. It doesn't matter whether we believe it or not because it never says this is the gospel. It says this is the generations of the Lord. It doesn't say this is the gospel. Later it says this is the gospel. So he's saying what Jesus taught is gospel. What Jesus didn't teach is just written by men. It's their opinion.
Hmm.
So that could be construed as Docetism.
So basically, a Gnostic would basically say Docete is actually not the resurrection, as I said earlier, but
Right.
is what our daily experience as a
Right, and
human being.
the biggest besides the incarnation, there's a lot of things tied to the Docetic controversy of what the church perceives as Docetic. I mean, there's the controversy over the virgin birth. There's a controversy over the incarnation, the baptism, the resurrection, and the pre-existence of the Logos. All this
Right.
stuff and what's the state of the dead, and was Jesus separate from Christ, or were there two Jesuses? And it all goes into the Christology that they're trying to develop. And
Yeah, if it wasn't for the heretics or the Gnostics, there wouldn't be a Christology at all.
right, there would be no Christology.
I mean, there wouldn't be a Nicene Creed. I mean, there would be none of this stuff.
There would be no Trinity for damn sure. The Trinity is a heretical idea par excellence. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the most heretical ideas in history, and that's why there's still people that oppose it.
Yeah, and as far as like the virgin birth goes, you don't really see that in the Gospel of John. That seems to be lacking. And the other Gospels, of course, talk about it, but
right. Originally, Mark, the Gospel of Mark, a lot of people are led to believe Mark is very Docetic, and it's actually not that Docetic at all. And they go, well, it's been around for a long time. It must have been around in the 2nd century. But the problem is that, see, Irenaeus' works were edited in 380 AD under Pope Damasus by the Roman Curia. And they, or the College of Cardinals, or whoever was running things at the time. And they edited them in order to make it look like Mark was in there. And Mark is a very Latin gospel. There's a lot of Latin in it. And the earliest fragments of it are probably Latin, And what's interesting is when Irenaeus talks about where the Gospels originate, he tells you the Valentinians used John, the Ebionites used Matthew, and the Marcionites like Luke. Oh, but the people that separate Christ and Jesus use Mark. Well, Cerinthus never used Mark, and he's the one that separated Christ from Jesus. Mm-hmm. That's directly stated by Irenaeus. So if Irenaeus is referring to his own work, which he obviously was, he's making a mistake about his own work. So it can't be by him. It doesn't make any sense. So Mark is definitely like a mid-3rd century to late 4th century writing. It's not something that existed in the time of Irenaeus. So you had the Gospel of Luke, which was originally the Gospel of the Lord, the Gospel of John, which was originally different than what we have now, and the Gospel of Luke was the Gospel of Paul. Mm-hmm. And you have the Gospel of Matthew, which is the Gospel of Cerinthus, the Ebionites, and basically the Sadducean Christians, or Sadducees. They're the ones that separated Christ and Jesus. Mark is just the Reader's Digest version of whatever they liked better in Matthew and whatever they liked better in Luke. They put the two together, and they picked which one had the passages they liked better. If he didn't like the version that was in Luke, he said, okay, I'm going to use this and this from Matthew, and we'll use this and this from Luke. And that's all it is. It's Reader's Digest.
Now, for our viewers who don't know who Cerinthus is, like, can you give an introduction of who this guy is, in case they don't really know what we're talking about?
Okay. Cerinthus is a guy that the first person that ever writes about him, as far as we know, is Irenaeus. And one of the people that gives the most information on him is probably... Okay, the people that do give the most information on Cerinthus by name, by that name, of course, which is obviously sounds like Corinthus. It's very similar. Are Irenaeus, Hippolytus after him, Tertullian under the name Ebion. He calls him Ebion, and then Eusebius and Augustine and a couple other writers talk about him, and Photius of Constantinople in the 9th century. What Cerinthus basically is he's someone that was probably living about 100 AD, because they talk about him being contemporary with Carpocrates and Saturninus and all these guys. These guys are all living around the time of Ignatius, Clement, and John. And Cerinthus is said to be the opponent of John. You have writers that only survive in fragmentary condition through Eusebius's church history, and that's Caius of Rome, who was an enemy of Irenaeus, and you have Dionysius of Alexandria. These guys were presbyters and bishops and stuff like that. And so Alexandria and Rome is where they're from. And they say that Cerinthus, he was living at that time, and he believed, according to Irenaeus, in a natural birth of Jesus. He wasn't born by a virgin. He was born naturally like any other man to Joseph and Mary. And you see that emphasized in the genealogies. like the genealogy of Matthew. Also, Cerinthus was obsessed with numerology, or the importance of the sacred numbers and stuff like that.
Right.
And so it's not gematria that he's into. He's into numerology specifically. They're two different things. And a lot of people don't notice that, but numerology is the idea that if your name adds up to a certain amount using gematria, that you're going to die on a certain day. And it's kind of it's kind of like astrology, but instead it's using numbers instead of astrology. And so that's why in the Gospel of Matthew there's so many generations. It's like 12 generations, and there's another 12, and there's another 12, and whatever, 40 generations, whatever. I don't remember exactly what it is, but he uses set numbers. That's why he cuts certain people out of the genealogy. So there's that natural birth concept. And different writers pick up on that and talk about it. For Cerinthus, angels are very important. He's obsessed with the idea that angels bring messages and stuff like this.
So he kind of goes against Paul a little bit there.
Right. He's very counter to Paul. In fact, he's accused, like I said last time, of writing the Book of Revelation by Caius of Rome. And he believed Yahweh was an angel. But most of the earliest people that they talk about that are Gnostics, and most of the earliest church fathers kind of have a hint that they believe the world's made by angels. They all kind of have that thing going on.
Yeah, you see that same theme a lot, and even in later Kabbalistic writings.
Right.
I think I mentioned Isaac, Rabbi Isaac, rather. He's a Spanish 13th century Kabbalist.
Yeah, you see that in the Talmudic legend too.
Yeah, you see
Haggadah.
Right. You see that.
Very Kabbalah, pre-Kabbalah. He had the idea that Jesus had a dove land on him at the crucifixion in bodily form, maybe appearing only. The Holy Spirit appeared to be a dove. So there's another Docetic belief about a dove. And this Spirit went into Jesus, and because he fulfilled all righteousness, like you see in the Gospel of Matthew, which is what he used. He believed in the importance of the angel Gabriel, which you will also see in the Gospel of Matthew. However, the difference is the later beliefs of the, I think it's the Elkosites, I think it was Elkosites. They were a group that broke off from the Ebionites who took on some very Gnostic beliefs. They took on the virgin birth. And Justin appears to be one of them. He's very obsessed with the virgin birth, but he's still obsessed with the Cerinthian millennialism.
Now, how did you put that at this, like, kind of that Catholic idea of the virgin birth? Like, kind of give our viewers of how. Oh yeah. Our little joke of how of what the Orthodox theology.
The Catholic, but when I say Catholic, I mean the church that. Every church that's around now that's a major church, like Lutheran or Anglican or Presbyterian or Eastern Orthodox or Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, they all used to be one church. They were called the Catholic Church, which means the universal church. They called themselves the Catholic Church of God, the Universal Church of God, things like that. This church, basically, their original theology, at least in its finished, polished form, is what you find in murals from the Roman Catholic Church in the 14th to 17th century, maybe even earlier. Like Giotto and a lot of early painters paint murals of this and stuff like that, where they show, and if you take an art history class, you'll see it. Gabriel essentially comes to Mary one day, and he announces to her that she's going to give birth to a son, and that he's going to be God with us, Emmanuel, right? He's going to be God. He is God. That's the Sabellian belief, right? Well, when he speaks this into her ear, this is the Word of God. This is the Logos, literally the Word. Which Logos is a funny it's funny to render the word logos as word, which logoi is word, not logos, but they took it to mean logoi. So he speaks into her ear, and basically by speaking to her, he turns into his words while he's speaking. So you gotta imagine that. You talk and then you're turning into what you're saying. And you're flying in someone's ear, and then he popped out her vagina 9 months later as Jesus. And that's what happened. So now this spiritual being has impregnated a woman through her ear, popped out her vagina, and they said that he overshadowed her, which the terminology they use there is actually the exact same terminology they use in the story about Zeus raining a golden shower down. I think it was, what was it? I forget what I think it was Danae or something. So they could give birth to Perseus. It was a golden shower, like urinating.
Is it? It's not the golden ass.
So he's urinating in her ear.
Huh.
With words, which makes no sense.
So Zeus
is essentially what's happening. Okay, so she's overshadowed, so there's different beliefs on it, but he became the logos, the word, and he went into her ear, and he came out 9 months later, and I mean, it might have been faster than that. I don't really know. I'd have to check, but so he comes out, and he lives as this man, and he fulfills righteousness or whatever, and he has a spirit come into him, so now he's like a hermaphrodite or something. I don't know what's going on spiritually. He's spiritually hermaphrodite because the Holy Spirit's a woman, so he's got a woman and a man in him, Gabriel and the Holy Spirit. Apparently Gabriel's the evil spirit. I don't know, but they're in there and they're playing around and whatever and telling him what to say, and that's why he can say, oh, I have this many witnesses, because he had voices in his head. And then he goes to the cross, he dies on the cross, the spirit leaves him, he goes down into hell, the spirit comes back with him or something, I don't know what's going on. And then he comes out of hell and he rises from the dead, and a bunch of other people rise from the dead, and he flies in the sky and he's gone. And that's the Catholic version. I mean, that's really what it is. It makes no sense. And then the Marcionite version, according to the Catholics, is he came down as a fully formed man who just appeared to be a man, and then he flew back into heaven as a thing that just appeared to be a man.
Mm-hmm. Kind of like a Superman. He's a Superman Christ.
He's
Superman
from
Jesus.
the planet Krypton. I don't know. He's John Lash's Jesus, I guess.
Yeah. Speaking of John Lash, what do you think about that meteorite that struck Russia?
Well, I think he's going to have proof for his theory real quick.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of like another little Roswell over there.
Yeah, I think that whole extinction event that they talked about with dinosaurs never, ever happened.
Yeah, I mean, there's been some controversy over that. I mean, I kind of wonder about whether that's true or not.
I don't think a small meteor could do that much damage at all.
So I kind of wonder whatever happened to dinosaurs. Was there some kind of disease going on? I mean, or maybe
There's
aliens.
probably just the sea level changing, because in ancient writings they talk about the sea level changing. In fact, it's the Wisdom of Solomon. Wisdom of Solomon talks about the sea level changing and things like that, and things that lived underwater climbing up on land and becoming men.
You're right.
And men going into the water and becoming fish.
Hmm.
Because of the changing environment, which was part of the theory of evolution at one point.
Yeah, evolution is kind of a interesting
evolution
topic.
Comes from Solomon, full on. It's in Solomon, it's in Genesis. The whole order of plant life and mineral life and the way it evolves and all this stuff is very much...
Yeah,
people have noticed it and made videos about it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, if you read Genesis 1 as literal, then yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, that doesn't make sense, but when you look at it as kind of an allegory for...
Well, yeah, if you look at it as one day as just an era,
right?
It's just it's not a set amount of time. It's an era. This is the era when minerals were the only thing, and this is the era when the sea level rose and whatever. If you look at it in eras, it's actually pretty fucking startlingly accurate, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And Solomon talks about how men are just beasts in Ecclesiastes. Men are just beasts, and they came from apes, and he studied apes. He was known as like the leading ape scientist of his time, and he saw all the variation.
Right.
And so he actually studied monkeys, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had what we were talking about earlier with the Orpheus and all that stuff from your blog, like with the snake and the egg, and how it was a cosmic thing is how they represent it. How the cosmos is also inside of people, you know.
Right.
And there's the whole idea that the sperm is the serpent and the egg is the egg, and there's also the serpent is the DNA and stuff like that. I think they were all well aware of that in the ancient world.
Right.
How they were aware of it, I don't know, but they were, you know.
Right. Like the whole idea of the serpent being kind of like the initiator of like sexual knowledge. I mean, you see that maybe in the Gospel of Philip a little bit, and maybe in right.
Well, you see it even in Deuteronomy where they say don't spill your seed on the ground and things like that. Hold on, we lost him. Let's see if we can get him back. Having technical difficulties, which we were hoping wouldn't happen again, but we might have to cut this off and make a part 2, which... Oh, we've got a viewer. Hello. Hopefully we'll be back on in a minute. Give us a minute here. Alright, I'm actually just going to end the broadcast right now and make a part 2 to it whenever we do it. Hopefully we'll be back on tonight. I don't know. I'm just going to end it right here so it doesn't end up having this long silent space on YouTube. So yeah, hopefully we'll get a part 2 to this very soon. Peace.